I was watering the tomato plants when Courtney walked out onto the patio. The afternoon had the quiet particular to late June in our town. Heat in the bricks, a wind just strong enough to make the tomato cages click against each other, the sound of my neighbor's mower 2 houses down. I had been out in the garden since 7 that morning, deadheading the salvias and pulling the bindweed that never stops pulling back. 26 years I had spent in this backyard. 26 years of clearing stones, of coaxing soil, of digging in compost that I hauled home in 38 trips in the trunk of a Civic. 26 years, and on that particular Saturday afternoon I was standing in the dirt with a watering can, listening to my daughter-in-law deliver the eviction notice of my life. She came out the sliding door with her arms crossed, wearing the expression she had perfected over the past 18 months, the one that suggested she had rehearsed something important in the bathroom mirror that morning, and was now stepping into the role. Court slippers, a linen blouse, a strand of pearls her own mother had given her. She had dressed, I would later realize, the way you dress when you want to appear reasonable. She didn't say hello. "Vivian," she began, "I think it's time the 3 of us had an honest conversation about the living situation." I set the watering can down slowly. The water kept running out of its spout in a thin, steady ribbon onto the patio stones, the way water does when you've lost interest in stopping it. "All right, sweetheart," I said. "Tell me. Nathan and I have discussed it at length, and we believe the healthiest thing for everyone, for you, for us, and especially once the baby comes, would be for you to start looking for your own place. Something smaller, more manageable for someone your age, somewhere with fewer stairs." She delivered it the way attorneys deliver opening statements, confidently, with the cadence of a speech, as if the verdict had already been reached and the jury was simply being asked to ratify it. I looked at her for a long moment. The watering can trickled onto the stones. Then I said the only thing I had ever needed to say. "Courtney." "Yes? I think you should look up whose name is on the deed, before either of you makes another decision in this garden." She blinked twice. The expression on her face shifted through 3 or 4 small weather systems before it settled on something I had not expected to see there. Genuine confusion. The confusion of someone who has said something with the weight of stone and suddenly realized the stone was hollow. "Whose name?" she repeated. "Whose name is on the deed of the house you just told me to leave?" Nathan said this was the family home. You assumed incorrectly. The patio went very still. The watering can emptied the last of its stream. The mower 2 houses down clicked off. I had been married twice. I had buried 1 husband. I had buried a daughter who had not lived long enough to bury anyone. I had lived in this house as its only legal owner for 26 of its 43 years, and until that Saturday afternoon no one, not my ex-husband, not my son, not the woman my son had married, had ever questioned that fact. It turned out Courtney had been questioning it for 18 months. "My name is Vivian Pemberton. I am 69 years old. I bought this house, this exact 4-bedroom colonial, the one with the wraparound porch and the garden my neighbors used to stop and photograph in July, in 1994, 3 years before my son Nathan was even born. I bought it with money I had earned over nearly a decade working as a paralegal, while I was still married to Nathan's father. I bought it with my own savings in my own name with a deed that has never once been altered. That marriage ended 11 years later. The divorce settlement, drawn up by my own attorney on a Tuesday afternoon in October, deliberately and specifically kept this property entirely in my name. It was not negotiable. It was not ambiguous. It was, in plain legal language, the only thing I walked away from that marriage with that I had truly earned. My ex-husband kept the boat, he kept the retirement account. He kept, in his view, the things that mattered. He did not contest the house, because he had never had a claim to it. And on an otherwise ordinary Saturday afternoon, tending to tomato plants I had started from seed in early spring, my daughter-in-law, who had moved into my home with my son 18 months earlier after their apartment lease ended. They had asked to stay, just temporarily, to save for a down payment on their own place, informed me that it was time for me to begin finding somewhere else to live. Courtney had moved in on the understanding that it was temporary. She had put it in writing, in fact. Nathan had sat at the kitchen counter the night before they moved in and said, "Mom, we're so grateful. We'll save like crazy. We'll be out before you know it." She had nodded. She had smiled. She had signed a 1-page letter saying she understood the arrangement was temporary. 18 months later, that signed letter felt, to her, like a relic of another decade. 18 months had a way of doing that. 18 months of fetching the mail from the same hook. 18 months of parking in the same driveway. 18 months of having their coffee mugs on their shelf in their kitchen, except it was not their kitchen. It was my kitchen with my wallpaper and my cabinets that I had sanded and refinished by hand in 1996. I did not raise my voice. I do not raise my voice. I have raised my voice twice in my life. Once when my daughter died, in 1986, in the small hospital room that smelled of antiseptic, And once when my ex-husband told me I had no right to keep the house. I have no plans to raise it a third time, especially not over a watering can and a tomato plant. I told them to look up the deed. Then I went inside and made myself a cup of coffee. While the coffee brewed, I stood at the window and watched my own garden. The salvias were just beginning to bloom. The lavender had gone to seed, the way lavender does when the spring is mild and the season is long. The roses, 5 bushes, all of them tea roses, were at their peak. White, yellow, pink, 2 reds. I had planted them the year Nathan was born, which was also the year my second husband moved in and the year my first husband moved out, and I had been tending them through every decade since. Through the marriage, through the divorce, through the death of my daughter, through the years Nathan was in college, through the years he came home for holidays. The roses had outlived 2 husbands and a child and a mortgage and a recession. They were not in a hurry to be inherited by anyone. I sat down at my kitchen table with my coffee and I waited. To understand how Courtney arrived at that particular Saturday afternoon, with enough confidence to evict me from my own home, you have to understand the blind spot she had been quietly cultivating for the 18 months she had lived there. It was not malice, it was not a plan. It was something worse than a plan. It was the slow, invisible erosion of a boundary that had never been drawn on paper and so had never been visible. When Nathan and Courtney moved in, I welcomed them with the whole of my kitchen. I cleaned out the second bedroom. I gave them the downstairs study. I made space in the pantry and in the hall closet and in the corner of the garage where the recycling bins lived. I bought a new sofa for the living room because the old one, which had been my mother's, was already sagging. I cooked dinners 3 nights a week. I drove Courtney to her doctor's appointments in early pregnancy. I paid the property taxes from my own pension, which I had earned over 38 years with a small litigation firm downtown, and I never asked them for a dime of it. I never discussed the deed with Courtney directly during those 18 months, because it had simply never occurred to me that the ownership of a house I had lived in for over 3 decades, a house I had purchased before Nathan was born, a house his father had never had a legal claim to, was something that needed to be explained. It would have been like explaining to a guest that the ocean was wet. But looking back on those months, I began to see the small moments I had dismissed at the time. I saw them like beads on a string, each one small enough to ignore on its own, each one part of a sequence I had been too polite to notice. There was the conversation around month 6 when Courtney had told me, in the kitchen one Sunday morning, that she and Nathan were planning to renovate the kitchen sometime soon. I had taken it as enthusiastic daydreaming, the casual dreaming of a young woman sitting in a kitchen she liked. I had not realized that in her mind, sometime soon meant within the next 12 months. There was the dinner, around month 9, when Courtney's mother Eleanor, visiting from Roanoke, had warmly told the table that they had a lovely estate and that Nathan would inherit the most wonderful garden someday. She had said it, the way mothers say things to other mothers, with the polite certainty of a person who simply assumes. I had let it pass. I had assumed she meant someday, in the abstract, the way people talk about inheritance at dinner parties. I had not realized she was using it to compute a timeline. There was the conversation in month 12 when Courtney, in front of the realtor, who had come to the door to ask if we were interested in selling, had said politely, "We're not at this point yet." The realtor had glanced at me. I had glanced at the floor. I had changed the subject. There was the time around month 15 when Courtney, walking the dog with the neighbor's wife, had mentioned that she and Nathan were thinking about repainting the exterior next summer. I had found out about it 2 weeks later from the neighbor, who had asked me, very politely, what color I had chosen. Each of these, taken alone, could be explained away. Each was an inch of drift. None of them was, by itself, the moment a daughter-in-law tells her mother-in-law to leave her own home. But they added up. They had been accumulating for a year and a half, and they had produced a woman who had stood in my garden on a Saturday afternoon and told me, with absolute certainty, that it was time for me to go. I did not raise my voice. I simply told her to look up the deed. The truth is, I had been considering doing exactly that, quietly, without fanfare, for longer than she had been living in my house. When Nathan came to find me in the garden about 20 minutes after Courtney had retreated inside, his face carried the specific discomfort of a man who has just learned that an assumption he had built a year and a half of life around was incorrect in a way that could not be quietly corrected. "Mom," he began, then stopped, then began again. "Give me a minute to finish watering," I said, "and then say what you came to say." He waited. He watched me empty the watering can over the last tomato plant, set the can on the patio ledge, and turned to face him with my arms folded. "I am 5'3". I have been 5'3" since 1955. I do not need to make myself tall to be heard. Mom, Courtney told me what she said. I want you to know, I think there's been a significant misunderstanding. I agree, I said. There has been. Which part? The part where either of you thought this house would naturally become yours. He hesitated. In that hesitation, I had my answer. Honestly, Mom, he said, I never really thought about the deed. I guess I assumed that since Dad used to talk about this being the family house back when he and you were married, that it was somehow jointly owned, or that it would naturally come to me at some point. I never actually went and looked. Nathan, I said, I divorced your father when you were 11. As part of that divorce, this house was specifically, deliberately, and unambiguously assigned to me. It was the only thing in the settlement I walked away with that I had earned before I met him. Your father never had legal ownership of this property, not for a single day of our marriage, and not for a single day after. He stood in the garden absorbing this. The roses were just behind him. The salvias were blooming. The neighbor's dog was barking on the next block. I genuinely didn't know that, he finally said. I'm not surprised. I never made a point of telling you, because it never occurred to me that I needed to. Do I have any claim? You have my love. You have a room in this house for as long as you need one. You do not have a claim to this property because a parent's love for a child is not the same document as a deed. He nodded slowly. He looked at the roses, then at me. Mom, he said, I think I made a mistake. I think I've been vague for a long time, maybe even avoidant, about clarifying exactly what was happening with the house. And I think that ambiguity gave Courtney room to fill in the gaps with assumptions that weren't accurate. I know, I said. I have known for about a year, in pieces. What do we do? We have dinner tonight. Both of you sit down with me in the living room. We will discuss this properly, in a room with walls, instead of in a garden with words that evaporate. He nodded. He went inside. I stayed in the garden for another 40 minutes. I weeded the lavender. I deadheaded the yellow rose. I did not let myself cry because I have trained myself, over 50 years of practicing law-adjacent grief, not to cry in gardens where the bindweed can hear me. The conversation that evening, once all three of us were finally seated in the living room, with the curtains drawn and the lamp on, was considerably harder than the earlier exchange in the garden. Not because anyone was cruel, because Noah's read as, Courtney, I said once Nathan had finished apologizing first. I need to understand something clearly. When you told me to find somewhere else to live this afternoon, what exactly did you believe was happening with this house's ownership? She was quiet for a long moment. The fuse in her lamp pulsed. I think I assumed, she said slowly, that because we'd been living here for over a year, contributing to groceries and some of the utilities, and being part of the daily life of this house, that we were somehow building toward eventually taking it over. The way some families handle multi-generational living. I didn't realize you still considered it entirely your property. I do consider it entirely my property, I said, because it entirely and exclusively is my property, both legally and in every practical sense. The contribution you and Nathan have made toward groceries and utilities, which I've appreciated, has never once been discussed as a form of rent or a mortgage payment or a gradual purchase toward ownership. It has been your contribution toward shared household expenses during a temporary arrangement, exactly as we discussed when you moved in. She nodded. Her face was a small museum of realization. So this was never building toward anything permanent. It was building toward a down payment, sweetheart, on your own home, which was the explicit agreed-upon purpose of this arrangement from the very beginning. I think part of it is that 18 months started to feel like an awfully long time to be somewhere temporary, she said. Somewhere around month 12, I stopped thinking of this as your house we were staying in and started thinking of it more as our shared home. I'm not sure I made a conscious decision. It just sort of accumulated, I finished. Yes, I understand that, I said. I am not angry about the feeling. I'm telling you what the feeling is not allowed to become. She looked up at me. Living somewhere for a year and a half, I went on, contributing to its upkeep, building daily routines within its walls. All of that can genuinely start to feel like ownership, emotionally. But emotional familiarity and legal ownership are two very different things. And conflating them is what led to the conversation we had in the garden today. Nathan spoke next, and to his credit, he did not flinch from it. If I'm honest, Mom, part of this is on me. Courtney and I have talked more than once over the past several months about long-term plans, and I've been vague, avoidant even, about what those plans actually looked like regarding this house specifically. I let the ambiguity continue, because addressing it directly felt uncomfortable. And I think that ambiguity gave Courtney room to fill the gaps. I appreciate you acknowledging that, sweetheart. But both of you need to understand something clearly now, since apparently it wasn't clear before. This house is not and has never been an inheritance you're gradually building toward through household contributions. It is my home. It was purchased with my own money. It is legally protected as solely mine through a divorce settlement. Any decisions about its future, whether that involves eventually leaving it to you, selling it, or something else entirely, will be made by me, on my own timeline. based on my own considerations. Courtney was quiet for the rest of the conversation. She did not interrupt. She did not push back. She did not make the kind of comment that mothers-in-law tend to remember forever. When she did finally speak, near the end, she apologized. "I think I owe you a real apology," she said. "Telling you to find somewhere else to live. In your own garden. In the house you actually own. That was incredibly presumptuous. And honestly quite disrespectful now that I understand the actual situation clearly." "Thank you, sweetheart," I said. "I accept it." It had been a long Saturday. Nathan and Courtney went up to their room. I went to bed early. I lay there in the dark and listened to the hum of the refrigerator 2 rooms away and tried to remember the last time someone had so casually suggested I leave my own home. There had been one other time, 1987, my then husband, mid-divorce, the kitchen counter. I had won that argument too. I had been practicing my closing statements in courtrooms for 15 years before I ever needed one in my own kitchen. I slept that night with the window open and the roses breathing in. The weeks that followed were understandably tense, though considerably less contentious than I had feared they might become. Courtney made a genuine effort to reset her approach to our living arrangement. She asked permission before announcing plans. She checked with me directly before discussing modifications with contractors or neighbors. She stopped telling people at dinner parties that the house was essentially ours. Small but meaningful shifts. Nathan and I had several more conversations, long, careful, and considerably more honest than any we had had in years, about long-term planning. I clarified directly and specifically that I did intend for him to eventually inherit the family home as part of my estate. But I also clarified that the inheritance would happen on my own timeline, not as a gradual informal transfer initiated by his wife's assumptions about my age or my capability. I also used the opportunity to address something I had been meaning to do for a long time but had not felt any urgency about. Until this Saturday afternoon, I called my attorney, Lawrence Hartley. I have known Lawrence for 31 years. He drew up my will. He handled my divorce. He once, when I was 61 and very tired, talked me out of selling the house to a developer who offered me a number I won't repeat, because the developer wanted the lot, not the roses. I met with him on the following Tuesday, the morning after the garden incident. I told him the entire story. He did not interrupt. When I finished, he nodded. "Vivian," he said, "I've handled enough estates over the years to know that ambiguity is almost never kind, even when it feels gentler in the moment than a direct statement. Families assume clarity will arrive naturally when it's needed. In my experience, it almost never does. Not without someone deliberately creating it." He paused. "What happened in your garden wasn't really about your daughter-in-law being presumptuous. It was about 18 months of unaddressed ambiguity finally producing exactly the kind of confusion ambiguity was always going to produce." He was right. He was almost always right. We spent the next 2 hours updating my estate plan. I transferred certain assets into a living trust, in my name only, with Lawrence as institutional trustee. I added language to the will making explicit that the family home and the garden and the contents of the house would pass to Nathan and his children, if and when I chose to leave them, on the date of my choosing, under the terms I had set, and not before. I also added a clause I had not had before. A clause stating in plain language that no beneficiary under my estate shall be entitled to occupy, manage, or otherwise direct the use of the family home during my lifetime, except at my express invitation and subject to my continuing right to revoke that invitation at any time for any reason. "That last clause is the one that matters," Lawrence said. "It is the thing your daughter-in-law will most need to read, if she ever tries to do again what she did yesterday." "Good," I said. I went home that afternoon. I watered the salvias. I called Nathan. "I'm updating my estate plan," I told him, "with Lawrence Hartley. Is everything all right?" "Yes, sweetheart, it's just time. But I want you to come by on Saturday with Courtney. I'm going to make tea, and I'm going to tell you both in detail exactly what is in my will and exactly what is not." He was quiet for a moment. "Mom, do we need to be worried?" "No, you need to be informed. There's a difference. They came on Saturday. I put the documents on the coffee table. I explained every clause. I answered every question. I did not soften anything. I told them, in plain English, what was already true and what would be true when I was no longer here, and I explained why the difference between eventually and now mattered as much as it did." Courtney read the clauses in silence. She got to the one about the family home, the one Lawrence had drafted at my request the previous Tuesday, and she sat very still for a moment. "This is the part," she said carefully, "where you say this house is yours, and that no one in this family gets to direct what happens to it. While you're alive, that is precisely what it says," I told her. "I understand," she said. "I understand why you needed to write it." "Thank you, sweetheart." It was a long tea. We finished it with the windows open and the garden visible. Courtney asked if she could help me deadhead the roses the next Saturday. I said yes. 6 weeks after the garden confrontation, Courtney and I sat together over tea in the kitchen, just the two of us. She had been thoughtful over those 6 weeks. She had stopped discussing the house with relatives in a way that assumed inheritance. She had, I noticed, started placing her coffee mug on the lower shelf instead of the one she had claimed for hers. "I've been thinking about why I said what I said," she told me. "And I think honestly some of it comes from my own family background. In my family, my parents always talked about our childhood home as something that would naturally become mine and my sister's someday. An assumption that was never really questioned or directly discussed, just quietly understood. She paused. I think I brought that same unspoken assumption into this situation without confirming whether it applied here. And I'm sorry. I understand how family patterns can shape assumptions in ways we don't always recognize, I said. But Courtney, I hope you understand why hearing you tell me directly to find somewhere else to live, in my own garden, felt like such a significant violation. It wasn't simply a misunderstanding about timing. It felt like being told I was already a guest in my own home. I understand that now, she said. I think I need to be more careful going forward about confirming assumptions directly with you, instead of just building plans around them. It is now a little over a year since that afternoon in the garden. Nathan and Courtney did eventually save enough for a down payment on their own modest starter home about 15 minutes away. They moved out roughly 8 months after our difficult conversation. They moved on considerably better terms than I had initially feared. Their relationship since the move has actually grown warmer and more genuine than it was during the sometimes tense final months of cohabitation. Courtney calls me occasionally now. Small ordinary calls about nothing particularly significant, about the baby, about whether Nathan remembered to take his vitamins, about whether I had tried the new bread recipe she had sent. Calls that feel like genuine relationship building rather than obligation. When they were finalizing their own home purchase, Courtney asked whether I would be willing to look over some of the paperwork with her, given my paralegal background. I said yes. I did not charge her. The fact that she asked felt to me like real trust rather than simply convenient use of my expertise. I do not regret the difficult conversation that followed Courtney's comment in the garden. What I have come to believe in the years since is this: unspoken assumptions about property inheritance and living arrangements, however innocently they develop, can quietly grow into genuinely damaging beliefs if they are never directly examined and confirmed. Sometimes the most necessary, if uncomfortable, gift you can give your family is simply the clear, documented truth about who actually owns what, and under what timeline any future transitions might reasonably occur. I am 69 years old. I bought this house over 3 decades ago. I protected its ownership deliberately through a difficult divorce. I have maintained it faithfully across 4 decades, 2 marriages, the death of a child, a recession, and a daughter-in-law who moved in for what she sincerely described as a few months. I will not apologize for the moment I firmly clarified exactly whose name has always been on that deed. Nor will I apologize for insisting that any future transfer of this home occur according to my own considered decisions rather than someone else's assumptions about my age or my timeline. What I gained in the end was not distance. What I gained was a daughter-in-law who understood the difference between an eventual inheritance and an assumed entitlement, and a family that emerged from one uncomfortable garden conversation considerably more honest about exactly what belonged to whom and exactly how those belongings would eventually, someday, on my own terms, be shared. A few weeks ago, Courtney called to ask if she could come by on a Saturday afternoon to help me with something in the garden. The same garden where our difficult conversation had first begun, more than a year earlier. We spent the afternoon together replanting a section of tomatoes that hadn't thrived as well as the others that season. We worked companionably, in the warm afternoon sun, in a way that would have felt entirely unimaginable during the tense weeks immediately following her original comment. I think about that day sometimes, she admitted, kneeling beside me in the dirt. I cringe a little, honestly, remembering how confidently I said something so completely wrong. But I'm also kind of grateful it happened the way it did, all at once, rather than slowly building into something worse over years without ever being addressed directly. I understand that feeling, I said. Sometimes the most uncomfortable conversations become the most necessary ones, precisely because they finally force everyone involved to deal with a reality that has been quietly, mistakenly avoided for far too long. She brushed the dirt from her hands and looked around the garden. The same garden she had once quietly believed mistakenly would soon belong entirely to her and Nathan. It really is a beautiful garden, Vivian, she said. I'm glad I get to just enjoy it now as your guest instead of always half planning how I'd change it once it was mine. That's a much better way to enjoy a garden, I agreed, my voice catching just slightly. We continued working together in the warm afternoon sun, 2 women who had once stood in that exact spot in genuine uncomfortable conflict, now quietly planting something new together. People often think strength is loud. They think strength is raised voices, slamming doors, lawyers' letters fired across kitchen tables. They are mistaken. Real strength is a 69-year-old woman standing in her garden with a watering can, who says the only sentence she has ever needed to say, and means it. Real strength is the morning after, when the air is still tense and the silence is heavy, and she makes an appointment with a 31-year friend and writes down, in plain language, exactly what she owns and exactly what she is choosing for now not to give. Real strength is letting your son read it, letting your daughter-in-law read it, letting them sit with the truth about a house that has always, only ever, been yours. And the day, a year later, when the same daughter-in-law comes back to plant tomatoes with you, and the only things you say to each other are genuine, and small, and almost entirely about the weather. Home is more than walls and a roof. Home is the place where your dignity is safe, the place where your name is on the ground and no assumption, however confidently spoken, can ever rewrite it out from under you. Mine always will be.